Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Hope the Passover and Easter holidays were enjoyable for all of you, but now we're back to regular programming, and back with us this week is Dr. Naysan Rafati, the senior Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group, talk about one of the big issues in the news right now, and which promises to maybe get even bigger in the coming weeks and months, Iran's nuclear program and the Trump administration's efforts to negotiate a new deal with the Islamic Republic or else. Naysan, of course, was previously a postdoc fellow at the RAND Corporation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the IFRI think tank in Paris. He also holds a doctorate from Oxford University and is, more importantly, an old and dear friend of mine. But let's not hold that against him. Before we get to Naysan and Iran, a few thoughts from me on the other big issue, obviously still in the news, the Gaza war. So at the very end of Passover, on Saturday night, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a pre-recorded video statement, what else, answering the question on everyone's minds, and one I get asked a lot these days: when will this war end? Conveniently, Bibi Netanyahu gave us an answer, which was, not anytime soon. I don't want to say that he said it'll never end, but that was the general vibe. It's not going to end anytime soon. But Netanyahu is very clear in the statement. He's not ending the war in Gaza, not for all the hostages coming back, not for any long-term ceasefire or some other post-war arrangement. He said, yet again, that the goal is the complete destruction of Hamas and that he wouldn't stop until that total victory was achieved. Or else, in his words, the next and future October 7th was only a matter of time. His words, not mine. Netanyahu also said that he hadn't given up on the hostages and that he was still working to get them all back. Fine. But it should be clear to everyone, and frankly it was clear to many people watching his video, that none of this really made any sense. Think about it. What was Bibi actually telling the Hamas? That even if you, i.e. Hamas, returned some or even all of the hostages, it wouldn't be of any use or make any difference to Israel. Israel would still go and strive to completely destroy Hamas, and Hamas would be finished, no matter what it did vis-a-vis the hostages. So what incentive does Hamas actually have to release any of the hostages if the end result was going to be just the same? Same thing, by the way, with the argument that if Hamas wasn't completely wiped out as a military force, that the next October 7th massacre and mass kidnappings were going to, for sure, repeat themselves. I've said this before on this podcast, but really, in what world will Israel be caught off guard again with another mass cross-border raid from Gaza or, frankly, anywhere else? In what world will Hamas be able to pull off something like that again, like October 7th, given its current state after 18 months getting hammered by the IDF? And in what world will the IDF not keep striking terror targets inside the Gaza Strip, even after a ceasefire is concluded? By the way, exactly what Israel is doing as we speak inside Lebanon against Hezbollah after a ceasefire was agreed up there on the northern front. But you see, Netanyahu told us on Saturday, the international community, quote unquote, won't let us go back to fighting if we agree to end the war. There won't be any legitimacy for that move, to go back to fighting. Our hands will be tied. This isn't the way the international community works. Bibi really said that. This isn't the way the international community works. This kind of deception, Bibi added, won't fly internationally. As one person quipped this week, by the way, Nahum Barlia, the legendary columnist for Yediot Achronot, and he was quoting, I believe, opposition leader Yair Lapid. This was the first time ever that the entire world is pleading with Bibi Netanyahu to lie, and Bibi Netanyahu is refusing to tell a lie. Incredible stuff. But the bottom line is this, and on a more somber note, let's be clear. 59 hostages are still in captivity. This Israeli government is clearly saying they're not the most important priority for it. And barring any unforeseen collapse by Hamas, either on the battlefield or the negotiating table, this war will not only go on, but likely escalate, and escalate likely in the coming weeks. We have to be ready for that, and all that kind of escalation entails for the remaining hostages inside the Gaza Strip being held captive by Hamas, what it entails for the Israeli soldiers who are going to be tasked with fighting and likely retaking the Gaza Strip, and what it entails for the people of Gaza. Let's be clear about that. All right. Without further ado, let's get to Naysan Rafati. Hi, Naysan. Welcome back to the Israel Policy Pod.
Hi, Neri. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
It's really my pleasure, Naysan. And last time you were on, I don't know if you recall, but it was August of 2022. So time flies, especially when there's a lot going on in the Middle East. Back then, way back then, the Biden administration was engaged in negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran, trying to put, as it were, the nuclear program back in a box. That never happened, and we can get into the reasons why. But here we are again in April of 2025 with the new Trump administration, once again in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to start here, and we should be clear by way of context for our listeners. The original Iran nuclear agreement, called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was first negotiated by Barack Obama back in 2015. And then Donald Trump, subsequently, after he became president, withdrew the United States from that agreement in 2018, at the urging, it has to be said, of one Benjamin Netanyahu. But 7 years later, right, after Trump withdrew from the agreement, give us a lay of the land, a state of play. Where do we find Iran's nuclear program right now in the spring of 2025?
Well, where we find Iran's nuclear program in the spring of 2025, I think the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency kind of summed it up well a few days ago. They have a ways to go before they get to a weapon, but they're not very far. So what that means in practice is that Iran's nuclear program is operating under somewhat restricted international access. The IAEA has inspectors on the ground, but some of their ability to verify, monitor Iranian activity has been curtailed over the past few years. And the top numbers that matter for people that follow these sorts of things is that Iran is enriching at a high end 60%, which is close to nuclear weapons grade. It has about a quarter ton of 60% enriched uranium, and that stockpile obviously continues to grow. And what that means is that the breakout time for a weapon is theoretically under a week. Now, I should clarify what we mean by that. That doesn't mean Iran can have a nuclear weapon in a week. It means that it can have the fissile material, the nuclear material that would be needed for a bomb in under a week from the point where it made a decision to do that. Once you get there, then weaponization is a different thing. And I hope this doesn't come off as a glib analogy, but you can think of it as if you're making a cake, you have to have the right amount of batter, but then you still need to put it in the oven and actually, bake the cake. So weaponization, the cake baking period, depends on, what kind of device you're after. If you're after just a simple, crude nuclear device without a delivery mechanism and everything else, but something that allows the Islamic Republic to say, oh, by the way, we have a nuclear weapon, that could be a matter of months from the point where they make a decision to move towards weaponization. A more sophisticated device where you have a miniaturized warhead delivery system could take longer, anywhere from a year to maybe a year and a half. So the breakout time window is short. It's been short for some time, but according to U.S. intelligence and I think allied intelligence services as well, there is no detected move towards weaponization. They are humming along at the threshold at 60% with accumulating stockpiles under limited international oversight, but have not put their toe over the threshold yet.
Got you. And yes, once again, the world's worst cake is the Iranian nuclear program, but it is handy for me and other lay people to visualize the batter, the enriched uranium as the batter for this cake. So that's where we are right now. Where were we, say, in 2018 when Trump withdrew from the original nuclear agreement?
So it's water under the bridge at this point. But when the U.S. withdrew from the agreement, Iran's uranium enrichment in particular was capped and would have continued to be capped through 2031 at a very low level of enrichment, 3.67, and with a very small stockpile allowed, 300 kilograms. So again, if you imagine the batter analogy, not enough batter to worry about a cake. But, beginning in 2019, the Iranians began to breach those nuclear restrictions. They also started kind of a counter pressure campaign to the U.S. maximum pressure campaign that also involved regional provocation. So we had nuclear escalation and regional provocation. By January of 2021, they increased enrichment to 60%. And then from April of 2021, they went up to 60%. So again, it's kind of, one of the questions that I get asked right now is, as these negotiations are going on, and I'm sure we'll get into it with the Trump administration. One of the questions is, would it be a better deal or a worse deal? And I think of it as two terms that don't necessarily apply, because you deal with the nuclear program you have, not the nuclear program you had 10 years ago or the nuclear program you wish you had, right? When the JCPOA was reached, Iran's breakout was, again, worryingly short, but it was still measured in a couple of months. And the high end of its enrichment was 20%, right? So that's a far cry from where we are today, where breakout time, according to U.S. Strategic Command, is under a week, and the high end of enrichment is 60%. They've also brought online more advanced centrifuges that can, enrich more efficiently. So from my perspective, it's, that the JCPOA model, and you mentioned at the top that the last time we spoke was August of 2022. Late August 2022, early September 22 is also kind of the tombstone end date of the JCPOA. That's where I think the process for the Biden administration and the other members of the nuclear deal, the P5+1 members, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and Germany, which were at that point, even after the invasion of Ukraine, still sitting around the same table working on putting Iran's nuclear program back in a box, as you said, and Secretary Blinken used to say,
back in a box.
Back in a box. That I think even at that point, the technical advances that Iran had made between 2019 and 2021, 2022 made it an increasingly complicated proposition to go back to the terms of the JCPOA. And I think that in terms of what a potential deal might look like now is something to bear in mind, that Iran's nuclear program in 2025 is not what it was in 2015. And we'll have to see the extent to which the current negotiations, if they get, far enough to engage in this kind of substantive technical discussion, are able to account for that.
I'll say it because you're being very diplomatic. Iran's nuclear program has never been this advanced. Hence the urgency on the part of the Trump administration, hence the, shall we say, urgency here in Israel, where I am, and also the urgency, by the way, by the Biden administration, even right after it took office in, early 2021, it was a major priority for them to at least try to renegotiate with the Iranians. Why did that effort fail in terms of the Biden folks and Iran? Just by way of context to bring us up to speed today.
Well, I think the Biden administration kind of had 3 or 4 stages over their 4 years. They came in and said, we're going to negotiate a reentry into the JCPOA and use it as a framework to build what Secretary Blinken used to say is stronger and longer agreements, right? And on a couple of occasions, so they began the negotiations around this time, around mid-April of 2021. And then they made some progress. Then there was a bit of a gap of several months because there was a transition of government in Iran, where you had the Rouhani team that had originally negotiated the JCPOA with the Obama administration and the P5+1, leaving office and having a more hardline administration come in. So that kind of delayed negotiations through the summer and autumn of 2021. And at a couple of points in 2022, all sides were very close to having an almost complete text. And I come back again to August of 2022 when we last spoke, and it was probably the last time the U.S. and Iran were actually close to having a text that was nearly complete. The Iranians put 2 requirements as part of the deal that the U.S. and other allies actually couldn't accept. And they bear, I think, importance now as well, because they're likely to come up. One was the issue of guarantees. The Iranians said, how do we know that if we do everything and we comply with everything? And even last time, the Trump administration was affirming that Iran, prior to the withdrawal, had complied with the terms of the nuclear deal. How do we know that you won't withdraw again? And the Biden team said, we can't give you a guarantee that this doesn't exist. If the next administration comes in and they want to withdraw again, there is nothing that the Biden administration can do to bind their hands. Even if you get into a treaty, which has a very high bar for entry, an administration can withdraw from a treaty. So there is no guarantee. And the second issue, which I think again will come up and has been an ongoing concern, is this investigation by the International Atomic Energy Agency into activities that Iran had undertaken before 2003 at undeclared facilities. And so the IAEA's mandate is nuclear accountancy, right? They're saying, we now know that you were undertaking activities at sites you hadn't declared, and we need to know what was going on there. Where is that fissile material? And the Iranians have dragged on this investigation over several years, in part, I think, because, they say we have never sought nuclear weapons, and this is likely to show that they were conducting, at the very least, proliferation relevant or proliferation sensitive research and development. So those two things kind of meant that by August of 2022, there was a text more or less done, but also a couple of hurdles that were looming large. But then a few things happened that get us into the kind of the second stage of Iran-U.S. diplomacy under the Biden administration, which is that in a matter of maybe 2 weeks in September of 2022, first, a couple of things happened. First, the Iranians put these conditions that the U.S. and its allies basically think, or maybe the Iranians are just putting poison pills on the table. They're not actually interested in this deal, that the guarantees and the IAEA stuff is a ruse. At the very minimum, they know it can't be entertained. Then around this time, August, September 2022, you have the first evidence emerging of Iranian drones being used by Russia in Ukraine. And bearing in mind that three of the negotiating parties are Europeans, the Brits, the French, and the Germans. And you have the Americans obviously siding with Ukraine against the Russian invasion. That really, adds to the detriment of the negotiations, and that, how can you negotiate sanctions relief or a nuclear deal when Iranian weapons are literally being used in Europe's doorstep? And the third thing, starting from mid-September, is the nationwide protests in Iran, the anti-government protests erupted after the death of Mahsa Amini in September of 2022. So those three things combined meant that for the next several months, there was virtually no diplomatic engagement through spring of 2023. And at that point, the Iranians and the Americans were both kind of cognizant that, this problem hasn't gone away. The Iranians, the economy was, still undergoing a lot of difficulties because of sanctions that were still in force. The nuclear program is still growing. So kind of spring 2023 through autumn of 2023, we have these reports of kind of quiet de-escalatory understandings between the Americans and the Iranians, where the Iranians, talk to the IAEA and say, okay, we'll try to work with you on these probes. There are no attacks on U.S. forces in the regions, or at least in Iraq and Syria, for several months. And it kind of culminates in September of 2023 with the U.S. moving some assets that Iran had frozen in South Korea over to Qatar so that they could be used for humanitarian trade. And the Iranians released several U.S. nationals that had been held in Iran for several years. And so that, again, seemed like, okay, maybe now this can be a segue to go back into some sort of more structured nuclear diplomacy. Then October 7th happened. And obviously as you know, better than most, the regional context shifted entirely, and the focus essentially from that point went from kind of quiet de-escalatory understandings to management of a very significant regional conflict that at various points, again, that you've covered in April and October of last year, included unprecedented direct military exchanges between Israel and the Iranians. And so the Biden administration wasn't at that point really thinking, how do we negotiate a deal that restricts its nuclear program? It's how do we prevent this conflict that, has started with Hamas's attack against Israel and then led to an Israeli campaign in Gaza, and then increasing volatility on the northern border, and then attacks by Iran-backed groups in Iraq and in Yemen into Israel, and then the exchanges directly between Iran and Israel. So at that point, it was, how do we avoid this conflict from turning into a truly regional conflict. And that basically took us through the end of the Biden administration.
Yeah, everything changed regionally, if not globally, but definitely regionally. And that's a good recap, which takes us up to the present moment, the Trump administration. So correct me if I'm wrong, Trump's envoy for many, many things, or at least the big things, Steve Witkoff, has already met twice with the Iranian foreign minister, and they're due to meet again this weekend, I believe. And so you already see, well, direct negotiations, but I guess depending on who you ask, direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran via Omani mediation. But why? I mean, the big picture right now, before we get into the details, is why does Trump think he can do better on this file than Biden? Is it just strictly a matter of them thinking that they have more leverage over Iran, that Iran is weaker, and that they can actually push Iran to accept things now that it wasn't willing to accept previously? Or is there more going on here?
Well, I mean, Trump himself wanted to deal with the Iranians in his first term as well, right? So there is an element of continuity, both in terms of objective and in terms of tools. So, to back up a tiny bit, what happened before we started to get these meetings with Oman, through Oman. The Trump administration came in and flexed two strong elements of coercive power over the past, from February in particular. So in February, they issued a national security memorandum reinstating maximum pressure as the policy of the United States. And we've seen that implemented through two particular means. One is, a ramping up U.S. sanctions. So we've seen several rounds of oil-related sanctions, et cetera, that have come in over the past 8-10 weeks, and significant, military presence in the region where you've got two carrier groups, obviously against the backdrop of an ongoing military campaign over the past month against the Houthis in Yemen, one of Iran's, non-state allies in the region. So you have those two diplomatic and those two coercive tools, the economic coercive tool and the military posture. And then you have, those being leveraged towards some sort of negotiation, right? And President Trump himself wrote to Iran's leadership in Mar. And again, we don't know the exact details of what the contents of the message were, but the Iranians responded to this message. And that kind of led to the somewhat unexpected announcement by the president in the Oval Office, I think when he was sitting next to Prime Minister Netanyahu, that, by the way, we're now getting into talks with Iran. So for the Iranians, the incentive is pretty clear. Their position is weakened in the region, both as a result of the setbacks to its non-state allies and to coming off considerably worse for wear from two exchanges with Israel, especially in October. And the economic incentive, is significant. They've now, the economy is already, in a rough patch, let alone with the prospect of increasing, enforcement of U.S. sanctions and their expansion. So the incentive on their side is, how do we get out of this and avoid both potential renewal of military confrontation, certainly, increased economic pressure that could lead to more domestic turmoil with a government that's faced 3 major rounds of anti-government protests in the past decade. And for the Trump administration, those exchanges of letters, led to the dispatch of Special Envoy Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister in Oman, within a few days of Trump's announcement. I think it was on the 7th of April, if I'm not mistaken. And then the first round was on the 12th of April. And
very quick.
And so we've had 2 rounds, and those 2 rounds, interestingly, the fact that they were at least in part direct is interesting, because I think the last time there was engagement at this level was, when Secretary Tillerson and Iran's foreign minister met prior to the U.S. withdrawal in 2017. There have been exchanges since at lower levels, but not anything at the level of ministerial or ministerial equivalent to the U.S. And so I think those 2 rounds were essentially a scoping exercise of, if we have a Venn diagram of our demands and you have a Venn diagram of your demands, do they meet at some point? And if they meet, do we then see how far this goes? And so this weekend, we're expected to have both another round of high-level, direct or indirect engagement between Special Envoy Witkoff and Foreign Minister Arabji, but also having technical teams, which we didn't have in the first two rounds. But that, could, past as precedent. That means that, the US and the Iranian sides will have people who are, specialists both on the technicalities of non-proliferation and nuclear enrichment and safeguards and all of the stuff that's on that side of the coin. And then presumably, sanctions relief discussions where, the Iranians bring in their sanctions experts. And then from the US side, you have people from Treasury or Commerce or things like that start to, again, say that, okay, if we have this Venn diagram with enough overlap, now we can actually dig into it. But again, at every stage of this, joking the other day that, if you'd said 3 weeks ago that the US would have had 2 rounds of talks with the Iranians that both sides said were constructive and positive and had a third round and a technical round scheduled, you'd have gotten incredible odds if you were betting on that because it did not seem like a likely proposition. But here we are. Now I compare this to running a marathon through a minefield. You've done your training and maybe off the opening gate or the opening line rather. But, these things are complicated. And now that it's not nothing that they've gotten this far. But once you get into the weeds of the nuclear requirements and the sanctions relief expectations and what other issues, for example, the U.S. may want to have on the table, the National Security Memorandum I referred to earlier, also talks about ballistic missiles, also talks about, regional proxies and regional provocations. The Iranians say we don't discuss non-nuclear things. So they've gotten this far, and it may be because there's a convergence, and it may be because there's enough ambiguity that both sides are reading into it that, yes, now we can move forward with it. But once you get in, the further along the process you go, the more areas there are for technical granularities that are difficult to overcome. But certainly on the Iranian side, certainly on President Trump's side, diplomacy is the option of first resort with, pressure and potential military options also available.
So we're going to get into the details of what they may be negotiating and how that may go and likely gaps. We'll also talk about the military option. Don't worry. But I wanted to get your sense before we do that. How weak is Iran right now, really? And I ask this as someone who you and I have conversations all the time, not with microphones. And you called it quite early after October 7th, in the early stages of the war, where you said this is a major mistake by Iran to actively get involved in this thing, which started off obviously between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. This is not going to go well for Iran. And lo and behold, you were correct. I was rather more skeptical back in those early days of the war because I was sitting here on the receiving end of the Iranian proxies. And from my perspective in the early days of the war, things were not great for Israel. Leaving aside the U.S. and its equities in the region, but at least for Israel, it seemed to me that Iran was winning. But obviously now, 18 months after October 7th, Iran and its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, even now the Houthis that are getting hammered on a daily basis by the Israeli Air Force and Navy, and let alone Iran directly, are not in great shape militarily, regionally, economically. So give us a sense of how bad it perhaps is for Tehran.
Well, first, I appreciate the shout out to my early kind of against the grain take, because it seemed to me that, from fairly early on, the Iranians were doing something that went against their usual MO, and their usual MO has been don't get involved and use the proxies to have, one layer of separation from anything that happens. But, from kind of October, November of 2023, when had indirect, Iranian operations, if you want to call it that, via the paramilitary units in Iraq, via Hezbollah, via the Houthis. It right. seemed to me like that at some point that was going to backfire. And, the Iranians' first preference in all of these things is, the entire, network that they've built up over the course of decades, the ring of fire, as strategists in Israel call it. The Iranians refer to this as a forward defense strategy, right? So you defend, but forward, not on home soil. You push the contours of the battlefield to your enemy's doorstep instead of bringing it on your doorstep. And
right, they want to fight to the very last drop of Arab blood, not Persian blood.
Well, but interestingly, starting kind of with, again, in like kind of the autumn of 2023, you increasingly did start to see direct Iranian fatalities, right? So even, and I think we've discussed this in the past, over the course of the war between the wars campaign that Israel has had in Syria when Bashar was still in power, kind of from 2015-16 on, the Israelis would target, convoys. They'd hit facilities, but they'd rarely go after IRGC guys directly because the point was to curtail the pipeline of arms, not to
Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC.
Yeah.
For our listeners.
That's exactly right. But starting in kind of November, December of 2023, we saw that the targeting did include increasingly, direct IRGC personnel on the ground. Obviously, that culminated in April of 2024 when there was a strike against what the Iranians say was a consular facility, killed several more senior IRGC personnel, but that was capping several months of direct IRGC losses. And that's the point where the Iranians said, okay, like if we respond, we, run a certain risk of getting hit back. But if we don't respond, we'll just keep losing, personnel and make it seem like we're entirely deterred. So, to them, that was like between two bad decisions, they went for the
worst
military response. And then again, over the course of several months, while Hezbollah and Israel were having, their engagements on the northern border, you also had the killing of Haniya in Tehran itself, so in the summer of last year. And then you had in September of last year, in course of several days, the pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, and then the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, again with another IRGC guy in the mix in Beirut. And that's when the Iranians said, okay, we didn't do anything after Haniya. And now, again, if we don't do something, it shows that we are deterred by the Israelis. And even if it comes at massive risks of retaliation, something has to be done, basically. And so that's when they launch Operation True Promise 2, and the Israelis retaliate. And this comes in a very circuitous way to your question about how weak is Iran. Look, relative to before October 2023, relative to this time last year, it is weaker, right? Several nodes in its axis of resistance are significantly degraded. Well, Hamas is one, Hezbollah is another. The Houthis, asterisks, depending on how much this ongoing, military campaign against them is able to damage their capabilities going forward. I mean, they're clearly still able to mount some kind of offensive threat, whether it's through missiles or drones against Israel and
this morning in Haifa.
North, yeah. So
Bashar al-Assad is gone, was toppled in a matter of days.
And Assad is gone. So is the network what it was a year ago? Clearly not. Is Iran's domestic capacity what it was a year ago? Again, clearly not. And in the Israeli retaliation for Iran's second ballistic missile attack in October, it was interesting what the Israelis reportedly chose to target. It was air defenses and ballistic missile production sites, right? And to me, that was interesting because it's almost laying down the gauntlet for what happens in the next set of exchanges. That we are not targeting your critical infrastructure. We're not targeting your nuclear sites. We're targeting the air defenses that protect those things. And we're not hitting your missile stockpiles. We are making those stockpiles a very finite thing because your missile production is now going to be slowed down. So, right. So you take all of that. There is, the regional network is not what it was, and the vulnerability is more than it was. Now, is that to say that they do not have a retaliatory capacity on the nuclear or regional front? And maybe the nuclear part we can come back to in a sec in terms of options, aside from diplomacy, but, they still do wield ballistic missile capabilities. They'll still do maintain drone capabilities. They still have naval capabilities. They still have some proxies that are able to threaten U.S. and or Israeli and allied interests in the region. So, weaker is relative. Weak is not. And I don't know if I'd certainly weaker, but still able to pose a concern for U.S. and allied interests in the region in the event that there's an escalation.
Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
As we mark Yom HaShoah, we remember the lives of the 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust and renew our commitment to ensuring that our people never again stand on the brink of annihilation. The collective strength and resilience of the Jewish people remain essential in this moment of heightened tragedy and uncertainty. As Israel's multi-front war presses on and the country grapples with rising domestic turmoil, Israel Policy Forum experts are producing timely, substantive analysis. Dr. Shira Efron, our Director of Research and the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Senior Fellow, wrote in Foreign Affairs about why Israel's overreach in Syria could backfire. In this week's Koplow column, Chief Policy Officer Michael Koplow explains how questions surrounding Trump's Iran talks and U.S. domestic anti-Semitism both highlight the need for Israelis and American Jews to acknowledge how their country's actions impact the other. Links to these articles can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
On this issue, just economically, how bad is it right now inside Iran?
Well, it's a question of relative to what. They've since Pezeshkian took office, that's
the Iranian
President Masoud Pezeshkian, who took over middle of last year after President Raisi died in a helicopter crash in May of last year. The rial, the Iranian national currency, basically lost half its value just in that period of several months. Now it's regained a good bit of ground just based on, in part, optimism over the prospect of talks, right? It's a bit of a bellwether of how the market in Iran sees geopolitics. Now, some of these, if you just look at the numbers, growth does not look particularly rosy. Inflation is fairly high. Currency has volatility. And part of that is obviously sanctions, and that will be deepened, especially if Iran's oil exports to China are significantly dropped from where they are right now. And they're also a function of just domestic corruption and mismanagement and problems that, aren't sanctions related. It's just an inefficient, bureaucratized economy with, a heavy state hand, a lot of shadow economy run by shadowy business interests that, in Iran, they use the phrase like sanctions merchants, of people who actually benefit from sanctions because they become the middlemen or the black marketeers or the profiteers.
Naturally.
Yeah. So again, it's undoubtedly one of the key incentive for them going into these talks is to get a degree of rhythm, get some trade, get some investment going, get their oil customers back. Right now, it's almost entirely going to China. It's unclear how much of that revenue they're actually able to repatriate and in which ways. And now, obviously, you've had a bit of a drop in the price of oil over, relative to where it was a couple of months ago. So the economic incentive was their primary incentive, arguably, to get into JCPOA in the first place. It's certainly one of the main incentives for them to come into the talks now, along with, the prospect of military action in circumstances that, at the very minimum are unfavorable to them.
Okay. So let's get into the brass tacks of, let's say, the diplomatic path, which is the more optimistic path. And like you said, even the preferred path of Donald J. Trump. What, to your mind, would a deal actually look like? Potential deal. As you mentioned, Iran presumably wants to keep its nuclear program and it wants sanctions relief. I mean, Israel, which isn't a party to the talks, but obviously has influence and is a player in all of this. Israel has been demanding no less than the Libya model, i.e. complete disarmament, complete dismantlement of the nuclear program, i.e. like Muammar Gaddafi back in Libya, who just gave up his entire nuclear program, although that didn't work out quite quite so well for Gaddafi. And then the Trump administration, depending on the day, depending on the official, what is their position on what a deal could look like, may look like? What do you think?
Well, so in a certain way, this is a question, we could have asked 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago when this whole kind of Iran nuclear crisis kind of started in 2002, 2003, because a lot of the problem set, right, is consistent, that you have a country that has conducted undeclared nuclear activities that are concerning. It is an adversary of the United States and key U.S. allies in the region. So you start with a proposition that has been shared by every U.S. administration, which is that Iran should have a nuclear weapon, should not have a nuclear weapon, right? Should not have a nuclear weapon. So that you start with that premise. So then the question becomes, okay, how do you go about it? And you have three options, basically. One is that you get them to dismantle it. Now you can call it the Libya model or the Iran should not enrich. That the demand should be zero enrichment on Iranian soil, dismantling all of the existing facilities, full accountancy to the UN, et cetera, et cetera. Now the track record for that isn't great. It's something that the Iranians, rejected, under the George W. Bush administration. It's something that they rejected, under the early Obama administration. I mean, one of the things that made it possible to reach a deal in 2015 is that the P5+1, the U.S. and its allies at the table said, okay, you're enriching at 20%. Breakout time is 3 or 4 months. We've spent like a decade trying to get to zero enrichment. If it's not going to happen, then we're going to move to the next best thing, which is restricting and monitoring that program as best we can. So that's where the JCPOA's limits on stockpiling and enrichment kind of come in, where it's, we would have liked to get it to zero. We would have liked to see them dismantle all this. Absent that being diplomatically feasible, then we move to ensuring that we have as much visibility on the smallest program possible. And that addresses the nuclear concern for a period of years, going into decades. So and when the Trump administration withdrew in 2018, one of the demands at the time was going back to zero enrichment. Right. And that was, there were 12, 13 demands in total, but, one of them was going back to the standard of zero enrichment.
Very ambitious demands back then under the first Trump administration.
Right. Well, again, the tools were powerful, right? Maximum pressure in the first term did put significant, economic pain on the Islamic Republic. What it wasn't able to do, in part, I think, because, like you're saying, the demands were quite ambitious, like, sweeping even, is that the Iranians were, said, if this is what you're expecting, you're not going to get this. And so again, now it seems that, you still have those powerful tools. You have, the both a strengthened military presence in the region and this economic campaign that's kind of been dialed up, but also more of an attempt thus far than there was in the first term to actually see how you can leverage that leverage into a diplomatic outcome. Again, may or may not. So you have the dismantling option, right? And again, we could have had this discussion at any point in the last 20 years. You have the dismantling option. You have the restrictions and verification option, which was the JCPOA model, but it doesn't have to be a JCPOA model. The JCPOA was 150 odd pages of very convoluted text that boiled down to a very simple bargain. We don't trust your nuclear program. We're going to restrict it and verify it, and in return, you get sanctions. That's what the 150 odd pages boil down to. And so you have dismantling, you have restricting, and then you have destroying, which is, and again, it's something that you hear now that if Iran doesn't agree to dismantle, then, we should take out the program or take care of it dismantle it for them or whatever phrase you want to employ. Now, the issue with this is that it's a little more complicated. We're not talking about a one and done operation. We're not talking about, an afternoon's aerial activity that then solves the problem. what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, there was some reporting your listeners should take a look at if they're interested in this, in the Washington Post and in the New York Times on U.S.
We don't read those newspapers on this podcast. Sorry.
Okay. Well, there are reports.
Kidding.
Yeah. There are reports of what U.S. and allied intelligence in Israel in particular see as the scenarios in the event of a military operation, right? And,
right.
The Post a couple of weeks ago, reported that U.S. estimates were, if I'm not mistaken, the quote is something like the setback would be months, potentially as little as weeks before the Iranians rebuild or try to rebuild that capacity. The Israeli estimate for what a strike could achieve is a little more bullish. It's closer to a year, but it brings back this question of, okay, so the destruction model is in and of itself a short-term setback, short to medium-term setback. Let's say a few months. Let's take the average and say 6 months. So what do you do in 6 months? Do you do this every 6 months? Do you complement a strike on nuclear facilities with other measures? Do you think that if the Iranian sites are struck, the Iranian regime will suddenly come to the table and agree to more than it's willing to agree now? Those are the kind of questions that if you're gaming this out, if you're a policymaker and you're sitting, if you're the president, or presumably that's the kind of discussion that you're having. Can we get them to dismantle? Track record not looking great based on the past 20 years. Do we have a military option? Yes, we do have a military option, but it may have, a different kind of, it's not necessarily a long-term solution, especially if they, for example, in one scenario, decide to rebuild, but in a clandestine facility and with the explicit intention of weaponization, right? So, and that's one of the things that the U.S. intelligence assessment was concerned about. So if you're content with buying time with that option, what are you going to do with that time? Are you going to use it as part of a different strategy towards the Islamic Republic that's not just a non-proliferation strategy? How do you contend and what do you assess would be the Iranian non-nuclear response, right? Will they attack the U.S. forces? Will they attack Israel again? And so,
or the Gulf.
Although the Gulf, clearly, it's interesting that you raised the Gulf. I probably should have mentioned it earlier. This is one of the differences with 2015 is that, in 2015, some of the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, felt that the Obama administration had somewhat kept them out of the loop. They weren't, and there are some concerns that I think will manifest again, that if you do a nuclear only deal, then how does it impact Iran's regional posture? But relations between Iran and the UAE, and especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, have been on the mend the last couple of years. We don't, not necessarily, friendships, but much more cordial and workmanlike. And this week, we had a visit by the Saudi defense minister, who's the highest ranking Saudi official to visit Iran since they resumed ties in 2023. So the view from the Gulf is that they do not want
the view from the Gulf is that they don't want a war. It's pretty much they're in favor of diplomacy,
which would put them potentially in the crossfire, which is what happened in 2019 and 2020. The last time we had maximum pressure, and Iran's counter pressure campaign is that you had Saudi Aramco facilities attacked. You had tankers blowing up off the coast of the UAE. And part of that experience, I think, is why Abu Dhabi and Riyadh both tried to, maintain lines of contact with Tehran. So coming back to the original premise is that, you have a dismantling option that through diplomacy has a low probability scenario likelihood, the kind of Libya model that Iran would voluntarily accept. You have the military reset option, which has a lot of uncertainties in terms of both the immediate retaliation and the potential non-proliferation consequences. And then you have the restriction option, which again, and you ask, what the Trump administration wants out of these. We've the president himself, says they cannot have a nuclear weapon. That is my red line, right? And then you have people in the administration like National Security Advisor Waltz, who've said very clearly Iran needs to dismantle, right? And then you even had, I think, Special Envoy Witkoff last week, use similar language about, suspending enrichment. Now,
this was after he initially came out with a much softer position. So he kind of corrected himself and hardened.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comments suggested that Iran didn't need enrichment beyond 3.67, which if you're, looking into the empty space of that, you could read as being that, well, that means that they can have enrichment to 3.67, after which, as you said, there was a clarification. But again, we wouldn't, I think, have reached this stage of an exchange of letters and 2 rounds of talks and a technical talk and a 3rd round of high-level talks without there necessarily being, in the rooms and in the letters and in the exchanges enough, like I said before, common ground for them to find an area of compromise. And you can find a lot of formulae that do address non-proliferation concerns significantly without it necessarily being zero enrichment, right? And there are ways that you can improve on the deal that was in 2015 that, like I said, shouldn't be the basis for comparison, but you can, figure out things that address non-proliferation concerns, that increase the transparency. And if your bottom line concern is, that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon, then again, that basic bargain of restrictions and verification might be the one that finds a sweet spot, perhaps with better restrictions and stricter verification, or a tweaking of various formulae, or, there's one option that, some officials have referred to here in Washington about, Iran bringing in, fissile material so that it's not doing it domestically. Again, I think the Iranians would probably have a difficult time with that because their counter argument would be, well, but then you'll just stop that. So how do we know, we need it domestically because, we can't rely on other people, basically. So again, like if the concern is the cake, to go back to the analogy that again, I really hope isn't taken as trying to minimize how concerning this is. This is not, it's not a good cake. But if you're worried about the cake,
there are some bad cakes out there as well. The cake doesn't necessarily have to be bad. I'm not a huge fan of, lemon pie, but many people are. So this could be my lemon pie.
Let's agree that a nuclear cake is not a good idea. But if you have a degree of confidence that the batter and the oven are, looked after in a way that you're in a cake-free or low cake probability environment for a significant period of time, or maybe even indefinitely, then, that is one way to address that non-proliferation concern. Again, we have to see, if the no enrichment dismantling Libya model is a U.S., bottom line. I don't think the Iranians would have, made it this far into the negotiations. But on the other hand, that could be that, they have an interest in going through the hoops and trying to, keep President Trump on side in thinking that, he's getting somewhere. And it could also just be that there's enough ambiguity, or both sides are reading enough wiggle room into what the other side is saying, that we've gone this far. Again, like once you get into the technical talks and things like that, that's where the granularities are actually going to be negotiated. Is it 3.67%? Is it 20%? Is it 0%? Is it limiting the centrifuges? Is it increasing the inspections? What does Iran do with IAEA cameras that have been turned off? All of these things.
The longevity of the deal, i.e. no sunset clauses. I think that'll also be interesting.
I think, and we've, seen both Secretary Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz refer to the sunsets. And for those who are blessed not to follow this stuff in this level of granularity, in the original deal, there are these things called sunsets provisions. It's not actually uncommon in arms control agreements to have sunset provisions, but the restrictions on some issues phase out over time. So in the case of the nuclear deal in 2015 and the Security Council resolution that endorsed it in 2015, there were, varying caps that over time would be phased out and other measures that would be indefinite. But one of the main ones was this restriction on the enrichment levels, right? So through 2031, under the original deal, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium would have been capped below 4% and below 300 kilograms. So that's an example that, people could say, well, why not 20 years? Or why not 50 years? Or why not 100 years? Or why not make it, in perpetuity? So that's only,
Right.
an area where, that would, if the Iranians agreed to no sunsets, for example, that would be a shift and again, ensure that there's, I was going to say a greater degree of confidence. That's not the word. None of this stuff is based on confidence or trust. This is all based on monitoring and verification, which is one of the reasons why, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has played and will continue to play an important role. And that's one of the reasons why Iran's lack of cooperation with them has been troubling over the past couple of years.
So last two questions for you, Naysan. The first question, do you think that the respective hawks in both DC and Tehran and other places will agree to some kind of reasonable bargain that, like you said, maybe they're making progress over the past 2 weeks, maybe in the coming weeks. Do you think that they will be ready to accept some concessions on their own respective ends when it comes down to it?
Oh, that's an easy question. I don't know. Look, look, on the Iranian side, there were a lot of people in Iran who hated the original deal, will not like a new deal with the Americans. But thus far from on high, from the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he's kind of, clearly gone. I mean, a few months ago, he was saying that negotiations with the Americans were unwise and dishonorable, right? This is literally, earlier this year. And now he's, clearly given a green light for his negotiators to go try to suss out what terms the Americans are willing to accept. And that the fact that he's, clearly greenlit it and hasn't gone so far as to criticize it outright means that, the hawks on the Iranian side, they will be tempered because the Supreme Leader has said, let's see where this goes. Right. But when the original deal happened in 2015, I mean, they were going through every paragraph, calling it a capitulation, concession to the Americans. And when the U.S. withdrew, they, did a lap saying, we told you so, we told you so, we told you so, that the U.S. is not reliable. And we said, don't trust them. And this is exactly what happened. And, they blamed a lot of it on their own negotiators. They blamed it on the Rouhani team and said that these guys were, naive and got played. And, so I expect, a degree of pushback from the hardliners in Tehran on any engagement of the Americans, let alone another nuclear deal that will restrict their nuclear program that they say is so essential to their, national security and all of that stuff. And here, look, it's, again, I think, a lot of it will come down to the president and how he feels that whatever terms, I mean, clearly Special Envoy Witkoff's position in the administration and being entrusted with a couple of these, high importance portfolios means that the president has a high degree of trust in him. And Special Envoy Witkoff has, made it through, 2 rounds with the Iranians and is leading the delegation this weekend to do the technical talks. And my assumption is that he will come back with the president and say, these are the parameters under which we think we might be able to get a deal. These are the things that are probably not going to, that we would have liked to see, but won't get a deal. And Mr. President, this is ultimately down to your call. Now, again, if there are terms that come up, obviously, the U.S. administration, Congress, DC, there are a lot of people with, their views on this particular issue will be focusing on every detail and every comma and in a potential agreement, especially bringing the comparison if there is a hypothetical deal to the 2015 deal and how it relates to that. And I would just say, again, coming back to the point I made earlier, you negotiate over the nuclear program you're facing, not the nuclear program you faced 10 years ago. And so I would just say that if we get that far, which again, at this point is far from a certainty, the issue should be, how well does it address present concerns going forward as well?
What did Don Rumsfeld say back in the day? You go to war with the army that you have,
not
the army that you had. Yeah, Don Rumsfeld. We're old enough to remember Rumsfeld. Naysan, actual final question. Is there a timeline, deadline for these talks to succeed or not? I.e., does it have to be done by the fall? Because I know that in the UN Security Council, there's something called snapback that the Europeans, I believe, or the UN and writ large will snap back sanctions on Iran. Explain that aspect to us and what the timeline may be for these talks working out. Or what did Donald Trump say? We want diplomacy and not the other option.
That's right. Well, in a way, we have maybe three timelines, all of which kind of converge in kind of late summer, early autumn. So the first one is that, according to some of the early reports about President Trump's letter and the start of engagement, that he had put a 60-day clock on this. To the extent that's true, it's ambitious, especially once you get into
Donald Trump did.
That was some of the reporting that there was implicitly or explicitly in these communications a 2-month time frame, either from the time of his letter in early March to the start of negotiations, but clearly not to drag this out for very long. So that's one potential timeline. Again, I think if there's progress, this Iran-US negotiations and nuclear negotiations in general, once you get over the hard part, you have another hard part. So if we've gone far enough for the two sides to come to some kind of agreement on scoping and format of talks, that's the hard part. But now you get into the granularities of sanctions relief and nuclear restrictions, which is also a hard part. So that's in theory a 60-day window. Another window, again, coming back to some of the reporting I alluded to earlier, that, there is an argument to be made that Iran's air defense vulnerabilities, according to public reporting, and the back-heel position of, Hezbollah and some other members of the Axis make this a window of opportunity after which Iran may have rebuilt some of its air defense capacities that were degraded, or that Hezbollah might have regrouped, or that, who knows what's happened in Syria, and we've seen how much Syria has changed in the course of 4 months, who knows where it is 4 months from now, you don't know where the Houthi campaign is. So that operationally speaking, it's not going to be easy, but it would be less difficult to do when Iran's retaliatory capacity and defensive capacity is more curtailed than it might have been or could be down the line. So that's timeline 2.
We'll do it sooner rather than later. If you're going to do it
sooner rather than later. And again, you now have a surge in U.S. air and naval capacity in the region. So again, the question becomes, if you're not going to do it now, you're never going to have a better time. The third clock is the one that you rightly referred to. So in the UN Security Council resolution that endorsed the JCPOA, it's UN Security Council Resolution 2231. I encourage you to read it if you're having trouble getting to sleep. Under 2231, they basically designed, and you know that in the Security Council, permanent members have a veto, right? If something comes up and any one member doesn't want it, they can veto it. Snapback basically inverts that proposition. And it says that if any one of the members of the nuclear agreement feel that, the deal is, that one of the other sides is in non-compliance, they can on their own and without being vetoed by others, snap back, hence the term snapback, all of the UN sanctions that were in place before 2015, right? And so that mechanism, that snapback mechanism expires in mid-October. And because of the procedures that go into it and everything, really you have to get that process started by, June or July, because there's a back and forth of letters and procedural issues, and the Russians holding the Security Council presidency in the fall that the Western powers would want to avoid. So that means that the three European powers, the Germans, the French, and the Brits, could have until October to snap back. And that is a powerful, card they can play to nudge the Iranians in the direction of a deal. And there's also a theoretical possibility that the whole thing could be extended, but let's not get into that for now. But yes, to your question, if there is not a great deal of progress, then that snapback issue starts to, come up quickly on the horizon. The Iranians have said that if that happens, if those pre-2015 sanctions are restored, they could leave the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. They might kick out inspectors. And so again, you kind of go into uncharted waters in terms of Iran's nuclear program. And again, if Iran withdraws from the NPT or kicks out inspectors, again, that will, probably increase the interest in a military option, because you may not know what's actually going on the ground at that point, or have curtailed sense of what's going on at Iran's nuclear site. So by the summer, between President Trump's, 60 or 60-ish days between the military window or the believed military window for a less risky military operation, and then finally the snapback clock, it's pretty high stakes stuff in a relatively curtailed time period.
Yeah, it very much is, which is why I wanted to have you on before whatever happens, to give me and our listeners a better sense of what has happened, what may happen, and a lay of the land. Naysan, you didn't disappoint. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Neri. Thank you.
Take care. Okay, thanks to the great Dr. Naysan Rafati for his generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum to keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening.